And so what I'm going to start with is the formation part of, for the beginning parts of it. And so we're going to kind of cover 5 areas real quick on it is the formation for limited liability. Then we're going to talk about founder allocations. Then we're going to talk about IP assignment. And then we're going to talk about other people's equity and hiring and things like that. And then we're going to get into what Jessica's going to cover is raising money, funds, getting capital and cash into your business. And we'll kind of do a deep dive on that early stage fundraising at that point. So
And Jason, before
yeah.
before you get started, are you all seeing the presenter view? I just want to make sure you're seeing the right. Does the slide deck
Yeah,
look
I'm
okay on your?
I'm seeing it.
Okay,
Perfect.
perfect.
Let's go to the first slide there. So we want to talk just a little bit about entity formation and corporations and things like that. And so first of all, from a high level, forming this entity gives you limited liability and protection. That's sort of like the last bullet point here. And what that means is if it's an alter ego to yourself that is set up and it has its own governance, its own bank accounts, and its own process and procedures that shields the individual stakeholders from liability. So it's like a bit of a like an insurance policy. And so the ones that you guys probably have heard about or get kicked around are C corps or corporations, LLCs, which are pass-through entities, and then one other one that kind of comes up is S corps, which is a tax election you do on a C corp. So just real quick, we're going to cover corporations because that's 99% of what startups should be. And the reason being that you don't really do LLCs often is that a lot of venture capital and investors can't invest into a flow-through entity. And the other ones with the S corp has some other aspects where you might use QSBS tax treatment. I'm not going to go too deep into the tax code on this, but we'll hit in a couple spots in the formation component of it. But real quick, Delaware C Corp is still the predominant structure. They're fast and cheap and easy to set up and get going for entrepreneurs, and that's why they're so popular. And really, the businesses are plowing back the money into the corporation to grow, to get to some sort of liquidity event. So that's why it works as well from an investment vehicle. So the corporation is sort of to set up this framework amongst the founders, investors, third parties, like commercial agreements, possibly if you're going to raising debt with creditors and debtors, as well as also giving kind of the general corporate structure of officers and directors, hiring employees and consultants. So that's sort of the rationale for setting up this corporation is it gives this structure so you can get funded and can actually move out there into the marketplace and build a company. So we touched base on it, but again, it is an entity set up for fundraising ultimately, right? And to hire people and to build out your idea and your dreams. Let's hit the next slide. All right. So things that you'll hear about when you form a corporation or entity, and I just want to kind of run through these so that you're familiar with them, but a lawyer will kind of help refresh your memory on them. But the primary documents really is the certificate of incorporation. That's what gets filed with Delaware. And we're going to talk about a Delaware corporation because that's really where you should be filing because it's still the most efficient and most known state to file these corporations. And you might hear out there, oh, Nevada or Wyoming for various reasons, or Texas or whatever it is. But be quite honest, if you're going to raise funds and from investors, angel investors or whatnot, Delaware C Corp is the most predictable, understandable jurisdiction to be in. So you'll file what we call a certificate of incorporation, and it basically gets the company formed. It's the legal documents that it makes it into an existence. And then it sets aside a certain number of shares that you'll be using to issue to the founders and then to employees and consultants and advisors, and then eventually for fundraising purposes. And that's a public document, so it gets filed with the Secretary of State, Delaware, and it's searchable. So just to let you know, what goes in there is public, but it pretty much covers what kind of shares are being issued out and the type of protections, rights, preferences, and privileges around those shares. Then the next document, and sorry, I'm kind of going fast, but we're limited time. There's a lot more to cover, and we're probably more interested in the fundraising part. But the next document is the bylaws, and that's not a public document. It's behind the scenes. It basically just kind of has the general corporate rules and governances, and it follows Delaware law, and it covers, shareholder meetings, board meetings, what's a quorum, and other sort of procedural aspects around voting and things like that. And then the next, so those are the primary sort of documents, and honestly, if just a kind of quick sidebar, when you're going to go raise, or excuse me, open up a bank account, you'll typically need a certificate of incorporation. They may ask for the bylaws, and you'll need a tax ID number. So those are the primary ones there. And then when we form the company, we do these organizational resolutions. So we have the board approve things in the incorporator and the stockholders as well. So you appoint the directors, you appoint the officers, you issue stock to the founders. You take care of other administrative matters like who has signing authority, especially like to open up a bank account and things like that. So you're just getting good corporate governance. You're basically kind of creating it in its existence, right? And the reason why we go through all this step is we're creating this alter ego, this sort of other person that's not you, that has its own functioning mechanism that gives you that limited liability. And I put a warning here on the slide that people, when they go through and use maybe some of the third-party kind of like Quirkies or LegalZoom, oftentimes the documentation might not be fully complete, or they tend to get some of it and lose it. And it's a real headache to kind of chase down those documents when you're into a fundraising process. So just when you get your documents, make sure you save them in a place that into the cloud, so you can have access to them. They will come up in your fundraising and due diligence process. So just a quick heads up there, because it gets costly kind of chasing down missing pages in your formation process. Okay, next slide.
And real quickly, one question we got is how quickly can you set up a C corporation? You can do it same day. So Delaware is really fast. I will say that's not the case in all the states. So I know there's been a lot of publicity around, the Elon Musk situation last year in Delaware, earlier this year in Delaware, about should we form in Texas or Wyoming or Nevada or one of these other alternate jurisdictions. Delaware is still the only one that is super efficient, right? So like for instance, Wyoming takes multiple weeks to get you a certificate back, right? So Delaware can do it the same day.
Same day, yeah, a few hours. That's a great point. All right. So the next big bucket that you guys are probably all interested in is getting your ownership or the group's ownership amongst the founding team, right? So you set up this entity, and now who owns it and who controls it? And what you want to do is issue out the shares to the founders at a very low price. And you need to pay for that. So typically be cash, and it might be a small check of 10, $100, or you can transfer intellectual property, business plans, things like that to kind of pay for your shares. And I just want to flag here, whenever you issue securities, that's the founder shares to yourself, or option plan, or excuse me, stock options to employees, or a safe to investors. Those are all securities, and you need to find a securities exemption for those. And so there's a one for the founders because they're all knowledgeable about the business and they're accredited underneath that sort of CEO, director, founder exemption. So there is an exemption for founder issuance there. When you're, just a quick sidebar, when we get to the fundraising part, if you're raising funds, you need to make sure you raise those from accredited investors. And we'll touch base on that more when we get there. But again, every time you issue some sort of stock, option, securities, you need to talk to a securities lawyer like Jessica or myself. So the key things when it comes to the founders or the founding team, right? It's pretty simple. If it's a single founder, you guys can own 100 shares, and that's 100% of the business. You can own 1,000,000 shares, and that's still 100% of the business. So the share numbers doesn't really matter. It's really the percentages that you've sort of figured out amongst the founders. But if there's multiple founders, like one or two or three, then what's really important is to add on vesting. It's really a protection to the founding team that people who are interested in putting all the time and energy into the business are going to walk away with the right ownerships percentages and incentive to stay along to keep earning those shares. So I'll just use sort of and there's sort of this problem with the 50-50 split that we'll talk about in a moment. But if we have sort of 2 or 3 founders, you can allocate them how you sort of see fit. It's really important that the founding team is on the same page on ownership from the very beginning. We'll talk a little bit about that in a sec, but the key points are vesting. And what that means is for founders, you'll actually buy your shares up front. And then over time, the company will have a right to repurchase those shares if you leave, and it will lapse that they don't get to repurchase all the shares back. So we call it vesting for stock options, and we call it right of repurchase for founder shares. But it basically functions the same way. And typical vesting terms are 4-year vesting, and it could be with 1 year with a cliff, and then we have some accelerations, double trigger, and a single trigger. I'll go through that in real quick. What does that mean? So 4-year vesting typically would just be 1/48th of your shares will vest each month you provide services to the company. If you add a 1-year cliff to it, that means for the first year, you won't vest anything until you meet your 1-year anniversary. Then you get to keep 1/4 of your shares. And then for the remaining 3 years, you get to keep 1/48th per month of your shares. So if you leave 2 years after the formation, you get to keep half your shares. Okay, so the standard one in Silicon Valley is 4 years vesting with a 1-year cliff for most employees, consultant advisors. Founders can kind of get away with maybe not having the cliff and just vesting monthly allotments as well. So the next,
And I will just say, like, whether or not founders have a cliff or not on their shares, like, practitioners differ on that, and it really depends, I think, on the relationship you have with your co-founders. If you've known someone for 10 years and know them really well, then maybe the cliff, it doesn't really matter as much, right? If you have just met them and you're not sure if they're going to work out, then that's when maybe a cliff makes more sense, right? Because the last thing you want is for someone to be a co-founder for 6 to 9 months, really not do anything, not pull their weight, and then walk away with a huge chunk of the business.
yeah. And 2 classic examples, just to sort of fact pattern on exactly what Jessica said, is either you have an engineer founder that finds a business person and they're sort of just learning to have a relationship together and they're all excited, but you don't quite know if the person you brought in is going to see it through, or vice versa. You have a business person who's hiring a CTO and they're still kind of working part-time at like a Meta or Google or Facebook or some other company, and you don't know yet if they're fully committed. So you want to kind of put that 1-year cliff in there to know that they're going to come over, they're going to be at risk for that year, they're going to put all their time and energy to build the company with you. And then once you kind of get past that 1 year, you should feel comfortable that they're all in and they've left whatever job or whatever alternative things they're doing. So those are classic examples of why you'd want to put that cliff in at the founder stage amongst the founders. Then there was 2 other quick concepts, is the single trigger and double trigger. So very common, VCs and investors will be okay if you accelerate the vesting on your stock if 1 or 2 things happen. A single trigger is simply a sale of the business, a change of control. You go public. If that event happens, the investors and the founding team should be more than happy to kind of allow you to keep all your shares. Okay. That's a little bit more, that's the more founder friendly term when it comes to investors, when you're negotiating with them, is that you get to keep everything at the change of control. But often a VC or investor knows that when they sell a startup, the team and the founding team is very important to maximize the value on the sale. So that what they'll do is say, hey, we want you to have a double trigger. The first instance is the sale of the business. The second trigger is if the buyer terminates you without cause or if you quit for good reason. Then if that happens, you get to keep all your shares because it keeps you sticky into the sales process, but you don't lose your shares if you kind of continue to vest unless the buyer just fires you without cause or you quit for good reason. And good reason tends to be like they diminish your salary or compensation, or they move you to a role like a head janitor or something to make it very uncomfortable for you to stay and earn your shares. So those terms are fairly common to be added in there as founders sort of friendly protections for acceleration of your stock. When you so again, with founder shares, you own the shares up front. You get to vote them. You get to start your long-term capital gains. And if you leave, like halfway through, the company has the right to repurchase those shares at the same price you paid for them. So if you paid $10 for your shares and you vested half, it gets to buy them back at $5. Now, because of your shares being subject to a right of repurchase or forfeiture, there's some nasty tax code that can come into play if you do not file what we call an 83B election. So you have to file this 83B election with the IRS within 30 days of purchase, or you miss out on this tax benefit of not having to pay as your taxes on the value of your shares as they vest over time and the gain on it. So again, we're not going to talk too much about taxes on this, but just so you know, absolute must, hard deadline is this 30-day period that you need to file this 83B election with when you purchase your shares. Okay.
Mm-hmm. And one other thing, just a flag that I think trips up some founders is even if your founder is not living in the US today, but will move to the US during part of its vesting period, that founder should also file an 83B election. Because if you're in the US for a certain period of time, you'll start becoming subject to US taxes, and then this will become a problem for the company.
Yeah, and it is very hard to clean up. So it's easy just to do now, even if you're not going to come into the US or something like that, just file them.
Mm-hmm.
Great point. So I want to just kind of flag a couple issues just around the founder sort of formation allocation. Again, I mentioned really important. Startups succeed when founders are all on the same page of the allocation amongst them. If you think, oh, we'll adjust this later when we raise money, we'll adjust it. It gets very complicated. Negotiations can tend to break down and destroy a fundraising event. So it's very important that the founders are all on the same page when they start out. Readjusting or tuning up shares can get kind of expensive. And sometimes it's not only expensive for the lawyers to help fix it for you guys, but also expensive to the founders of buying shares, repurchasing shares, reallocating stuff. It happens, but you really want to avoid any kind of change or true up going forward, absent sort of it's not working out with that founder, and then you need to kind of terminate them or they need to leave and repurchase those shares. And then the big one that you kind of comes up with a lot of founders is this 50-50 split concept. And I've had this happen multiple times. It's a very similar story. Two founders, they say, well, we trust each other. We don't want to put any vesting. So they don't put any vesting on their shares. And they do a 50-50 split and they're off to the races. And then about 3 or 4 months in, one of them finds a girlfriend. And then they fall in love and they move to the Caribbean. And then the person's sort of sitting in the Caribbean on the beach and he owns 50% of the business, and the other founder's like, I'm working my ass off here trying to make this thing work out. Can you give me back my shares so I can go hire a new CTO or whatever? And they usually say no. And then you're stuck. So the main point of it is vesting is very important, and try to avoid the 50-50 split or stall outs, because you can we'll get to the board structure a little bit in a second, but you can deadlock your board, you can deadlock a lot of voting issues. So oftentimes people may solve this by one person having just a slightly bit more shares, or again, the vesting is very important. Okay, let's jump to the next one. It's going to probably be, yeah, cap table. So this is a pretty standard cap table, and I just wanted to kind of use this as an illustration to talk about what it looks like in a couple vocabulary terms that you're going to hear about when you form your company and do fundraising. Okay, so here we have 3 founders. The first 2 are getting a 3.5 million shares issued to them. They're going to buy them out straight. The third founder, same thing. They're going to buy the 200,000 shares. And so I wanted to point this out, that there'll be founders that have vastly different percentages on your structure, and that's okay. As long as you guys agree on that and what your roles are and your titles and things like that, that is totally fine. It does not need to be equals 50-50 or 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. It just depends. Sometimes the CEO gets a slightly bit more than the CTO, or however you guys sort of figure it out. Then the next thing is, and we'll talk a little bit more about options in detail in a sec, but we will set aside an option pool. So in this scenario, we put a 1.8 million shares set aside, or roughly 20% of the business, for future grants to employees, consultants, and advisors. Okay, we've just set it aside. The only shares that are issued at the moment are the 7.2 million shares in my example, okay? That actually makes up 100% of the voting shares, okay? But on a fully diluted basis is the 80% for the founders and 20% for the option pool, okay? So you're going to hear things about issued and outstanding. That's just to the founders in this example. And you're going to hear words like fully diluted, and that's the founders plus the pool that's set aside, okay? And another concept that you'll hear about is authorized stock and issue stock. So here we've authorized 10 million shares. Just think of them as blank checks that you can write, okay? So you have 10 million shares you can give to whoever. They've given 7.2 million of these shares to actual founders that they've sold. They're out there, they get to vote. Those are the issued shares. They've reserved 1.8 million shares for their pool. Okay, they haven't been issued yet, but it's like another sort of blank check up to that amount. And now they have 1 million shares of authorized stock that they can issue later on. If they need to increase the pool, they can use it for that. If they need to use it for special commercial agreements where they want to have a warrant with some sort of third party or incentivize other sweeteners with investors, they have this reserve of 1 million shares they could use in theory. So the key takeaway is there's multiple vocabulary in a cap table. There's issued and outstanding. Again, that's what's actually sold and issued. There's fully diluted, which takes into account the reserved option pool. Let's go to the next slide. So conflicts between founders, we talked a bit about the vesting and how to kind of solve that. We've talked a bit about the deadlock 50-50 towards the bottom up there. Again, what you need to understand a bit is how corporations work, okay? So stockholders get to elect the directors, okay? So we'll just use an example. If it's 50-50, then the two shareholders get to elect the directors, 2 directors themselves. If it's 3, then a majority, 2 of the 3 will get to elect the directors, and it can be 1, 2, 3 directors, or you kind of want to kind of limit it to that if you're doing an early stage company. But then the directors get to appoint the officers, the CEO, the CFO, the treasurer, okay? So remember, the shareholders control the board members control the officers, and then the officers control hiring employees and consultants, okay? So you need to sort of think about what role you play in the business. Are you on the board? How do the founders kind of want to work that structure out, and then what the officer titles are and things like that. So I kind of already went through sort of the repurchase aspects and sort of the deadlock issues. But just to remember, when you are sitting on a board as a board member or as an officer, you also have fiduciary duties to all the shareholders, even to the people you might be mad at. So you have to behave with duty of care and duty of loyalty to all shareholders, to the ones you love, the ones you hate. You have to treat them equally. You cannot pick favorites. So that's just something you need. We can get talk to your lawyer a bit more about if you have these issues come up, but I just wanted to flag there's fiduciary duty issues that when you become an officer and director. Maybe let's go to the next slide here.
Okay, and just to answer one question that came in, the question was, what's the point of having some authorized but kind of unreserved or unissued shares? So the purpose for that is to avoid having to amend your charter later. So the plan, right, which is where you have the reserve, that can only be used for individuals. So to the extent you're issuing equity to consultants, right? A lot of consultants want to be hired through their LLC or some other entity structure. Those shares have to be issued outside of the plan. And so that's why you keep that bucket of authorized shares. Or let's say you find someone who's awesome who wasn't part of your plan in the initial founder group, but you find someone you have to have because they're just a critical part you didn't know you needed. You would typically give a big, if you're giving them a big chunk, right? And you think it would take too much from the pool, you would sometimes take that from authorized shares that aren't part of the pool. So the goal of keeping some authorized shares just kind of set aside is to avoid the expense of having to amend the charter later, both your lawyer's time and the filing fees for doing so.
Great question. All right, next slide. So we're gonna go to the next big bucket for a startup, IP assignment and ownership, right? So a startup at the end of the day is a collective of the team you bring, all the intellectual property that the company owns, and then hopefully the broader market. And that's what the investors are going to be investing in. And so the investors want to know that everyone who's touched the company has assigned the IP they've created to the company and is protecting not only trademarks, patents, but trade secrets. So you need confidentiality agreements in place as well. So the key takeaway, everyone and anyone who touches your business needs to sign an IP assignment and confidentiality agreement. They are sometimes referred to as PIIAs, CIIAs, CIA, PI, and that kind. But it basically assigns the IP and keeps things confidential. Okay, when we form a company, typically founders have been kind of running around doing stuff, creating business plans, creating IP, working on their ideas, and when there's no entities, it belongs with them. When we form it and issue you your founder shares, at that time, everything that the founding team has done in the past, we assign to the company as well. So it looks back, it's like retrospective, okay? The founders also, and all team members, will sign a PIA or CIA from anything they do with the company now, once it's formed, going forward. It all belongs to the company. Those are the things that get diligenced very deeply in a fundraising. So it's really important. People sign them, you keep good records of this, and it's very hard to kind of clean up some of these items if someone goes away that you've had a consultant for a month or two and you can't chase them down and they've done some part of your IP. Sometimes you have to throw away that code base and restart from scratch and things like that. So, but real quick, it's just assigning whatever they create to the company. They're keeping things confidential for trade secret protection. When you hire people, employees, you'll have an offer letter. When you have consultants, you'll have a consultant agreement or contractors agreement as well. When you're employment, pretty much everyone will be at will employees. You can hire and fire them at any time. There's some caveats there around labor laws, but basically that's the intent. And then with contractors, it's just a third party group that you're contracting with. I think I get into a slide a little bit more about employment matters in 2 slides, so I'll kind of touch base on that in a second. The other thing that you'll see in these CIAs and PIAs is non-solicitation. Usually it's just limited to, you won't solicit away employees that work for the company. So if someone departs and starts at another one, they won't steal the employees for a certain period of time. Usually it's 12 months or maybe 2 years at the most. Each state is slightly different in their restrictions. Another one, which you won't see often in California because they're prohibitive here, is a non-compete, where you can't compete with the business you're doing. But there are states where they are enforceable. Some have caveats on limitation on geography, time, and scope. So each state is different. Generally speaking, we do not see non-competes for startups, but we do see enforceable non-solicitations that are reasonable in scope and time. Okay, next item.
And just one other point, which I may come up later too, is that these agreements are critical when it comes to fundraising. It is one of the things that every investor will check. Company will always have to make a representation that it got these agreements assigning IP to the company. And believe it or not, the language in the IP assignment agreement is important too, right? It has to be present tense language. For instance, otherwise it may not be enforceable. So this agreement, right, in addition to the agreements, the IP assignment agreements are really important not to screw up, because it could become a really big problem to fix it in the future, especially if some of those service providers have since left the company.
Yeah. Great. I mean, one small aside, because we get this question a lot, founders putting money into the company, how do you treat that? So real quick, what we recommend is you keep track of it. You can create short-term promissory notes. It's a loan to the company. You keep track of your expenses. So if you get fundraising, you can kind of reimburse yourself or start generating revenue. You can reimburse yourself for the expenses. And then later, when the company gets fundraising, or if you're generating cash, you can pay back the loan to yourself. Sometimes people will negotiate, or it gets negotiated upon them, that they'll convert their debt into equity, into preferred equity, versus just writing off. A lot of VCs and investors will say, hey, that was your sweat equity and you just need to write it off and eat it. But I really resist that, as long as the debt's not too massive, or we can kind of work with it. But at the end of the day, better off to get something for it than nothing. So it might convert into preferred equity. But ultimately, you want to keep track of those expenses. You want to think of them as loans and or reimbursements for expenses, especially for tax purposes. And that, so we'll just move on because we're running short on time, but I just wanted to flag that and there's an article that I wrote on our Perkins Coie Startup Percolator exactly on this point. We have tons of resources as well on the Perkins Coie Startup Percolator website as well. Okay, employment matters. So we talked, kind of speeding things up, we talked about offer letters for employees, consulting agreements for consultants, IP assignment agreements. In it, what you're going to do is you're going to talk about probably equity or stock, because especially in consultants agreements, you're going to probably use shares versus money because you don't have a lot of money. Same thing, you'll incentivize your early team with bigger share grants versus money. But you don't want to talk percentages because percentages can get problematic. You want to talk about share numbers, and you'll figure out what share numbers. You can say orally, this is about 1% of the business. But the problem is if you offer 3 people about 1% of the business, well, when you issue 1 shares to one person, then you kind of have to give them a bit more to the next person to truly get a 1%. So avoid using percentages. Always use shares. Always use shares. Just a flag, employees are you're legally required to pay a minimum wage. Often most startups don't. And so I just wanted to flag this. Early stage companies, early stage startups are going to probably run risks around labor and employment law and wage laws. So that's just the way it is. It's a sticky thing. So you're going to take on some labor risk early on until you can get funding and actually pay people at least the minimum wage. The other kind of risks happens is, oh, I want to hire them as a consultant and give them shares, but they perform and act as an employee. Again, there's sort of not great ways around it. You just sort of have to absorb that risk at first. And when you get resources and kind of can fix things, you do that as soon as possible. And then the other one I wanted to flag as well is you should get a non-disclosure agreement in place with people before you employ them as consultants or employees. Typically, early stage companies, the people that they're employing are engineers or real thought leaders, and you're divulging out your secrets and things like that. And if they don't accept the employment and you didn't put an NDA in place, they can kind of go away and take that. So when you say, hey, I would love to talk to you about employment, can you please sign this NDA? Because I want to be able to have a more open and free conversation about the roles and possibility and what we're building. So at least you have some protections. You've set the expectation that they're going to keep that information confidential. Okay, next slide. We talked a bit about stock option plans or stock plans. Again, these are reserved shares that you give to employees, consultants, advisors. They must be providing services to the company at the time of grant. Okay. The board, I think I get into this a little bit, but the board sets the fair market value, and you need to have proper board approval for it. Each time you issue out the securities. And again, they're securities, so you need to find exemptions, and each state might have a slightly different exemption. So it's very important to know the address and where someone lives and is domiciled, so the securities lawyers like ourselves can help find the proper exemption for you. And it's really important to keep all this stuff well maintained, a cap table well maintained, so that it's clean and easy for when you go into the fundraising process. And next slide.
And there's a lot of this is one of the areas where companies can really screw up if they're not working with the right counsel, frankly, and just doing it on their own. For instance, you cannot backdate options. You can say, I'm granting options today, and you could set the vesting date sometime in the past, but you can't backdate options. For instance, you have to issue options at fair market value for the exercise price. So anyway, this is one of the areas you really want to get right, or it's going to be very expensive. There's not a fix necessarily in the future, and it can get very expensive and could blow up a financing.
Yeah, exactly. So just a little bit about the process. The board will set the fair market value. If it's stock options, they will typically get an independent valuation report called 409A valuation report. And the reason is you want to get the benefit of the safe harbor of making sure you get the valuation correct. If you don't have that, you have to prove to the IRS you did it right, and the penalties can be pretty stiff if you got it wrong. And a lot of startup is sort of guesswork, so it's better to get the independent report and shift the burden back to the IRS. These 409A reports have gotten relatively inexpensive to get nowadays. They used to be 40 or 50K in the past, and now they're a couple grand, sometimes free for the first one with some of the providers as well. And that gives the board the ability to rely on that report and then set the fair market value. Then the board will approve who's getting the shares, the number of shares, the vesting terms. Typically what's the vesting start date is a 4-year vesting with a 1-year cliff, which is the most common. And then ISO or NSO grant, which we'll get to in just a sec. But again, the recipient must be providing services at the time of grant. What happens a lot is they have this consultant for 3 months, and then the consultant leaves, and then the board wants to decide to grant that consultant shares out of their plan. It cannot do that. It has to be during the time that they're providing services to the business. So if they're working for 3 months and they're going to leave in the next week, the board should meet and grant those shares pretty quickly so that they're doing it while they're providing services. And then typically when an employee or a consultant leaves, they have 3 months to exercise that grant or it goes away, and those shares go back into the pool for the company to re-grant to future employees or consultants. So they usually have just 3 months to exercise the options or they go away. Next slide real quick. So I want to make sure we have time for the fundraising. So there's 2 types of grants. ISO, incentive stock option grants. The quick up for this one is they can only be issued to employees. They can only be issued to employees, and they get certain tax benefits. There's no tax on the date of grant, and this is the important one. There's no tax at the date they exercise, okay? There is an alternative minimum tax aspect that does apply, so there's some nuance there, but ultimately there's some better tax treatment for these ISO grants. That's why employees want to get them, but they can only be granted to employees. They will have to be at 100% the fair market value unless it's a huge grant of 10% shareholder, then it's 110. The maximum term for these grants to sort of sit out there before someone exercises 10 years, unless they're a 10% shareholder, then it's 5 years. Again, 3 months termination or 12 months if they are leave for disability. The next slide, please.
And just quickly, like the reason why ISOs are beneficial, there's a lot of requirements to apply, but you save the recipient saves money in taxes. It's a U.S. tax benefit though, so it only applies to U.S. employees.
Yeah. And then NSOs, non-qualified, non-statutory stock options, is everything but an ISO. And again, there's no tax on the grant, but at the exercise, you're taxed on the spread. So, for example, if the exercise price is $1, exercise $1 and you leave and you want to exercise your grant, but the fair market value of the shares are now $2, you're going to pay tax of $1 of gain at a time when you're not getting liquidity from those shares, right? So that's the rub. Why people prefer ISOs, but again, you can only do those to employees, and all this tax stuff is only relevant to the U.S. Jessica pointed out. I think just kind of moving on. So we're now into the really good part of investment, and I'm going to turn it over to Jessica, and then I'll comment from the peanut gallery and look at the questions in there in the chat room. Thank you.
Okay, so sorry guys, we're running short on time, so this is going to be a little bit of a sprint to the end. So a lot of the question, we're going to run through kind of the pre-seed funding, if you will, which is where all the early stage founders are playing, right? This is when you have an idea, maybe you have a little bit of code, depending on what you're doing, but you don't really have revenue yet, or maybe you have a little bit of revenue. So you're trying to raise some money to grow the business. So one question is, how much should I raise, right? And that really just depends on your circumstances. How much cash do you need? What do you need to actually get to a priced round later, right? What are investors going to expect to see in a priced round? And what are the milestones you have to get to? Usually closing a priced round, meeting the investors, going through the diligence process, getting them comfortable with putting money in will often take 6 to 12 months. It's actually quite a long period of time. Sometimes it's shorter than that. But that's something to think about too when you're raising this initial pre-seed round, to figure out, okay, well, how much cash do I need to get to the milestone and then to run the fundraising process for the next round? And then obviously the amount you raise and the valuations you agree to determines your dilution. So if you're raising 1 million, at a 10 million valuation versus 1 million at a $20 million valuation, right? You're going to give up a lot more of the company at the $10 million valuation versus the 20. So you just got to keep that in mind as you are offering terms to investors.
Yeah, and the key thing is always to run the numbers and understand roughly what percentage you're giving up. That's the most important thing. Okay.
Yeah, and we'll talk about pre versus post money valuations in a few slides. What I find though is not most, but quite a few founders that we work with do not understand the economics that they are offering in their pre-seed round. Like they don't fully grasp how much of the company they're giving away. And so it's really important to do the math. Most people are scared of Excel, but it's not scary, I promise. Okay, so there's two different types of convertible securities that you typically see: convertible notes and safes. Safes are by far the most used nowadays in the pre-seed or these bridge rounds. You will see convertible debt come up, sometimes more in like the life science space than others, right? If you're trying to get angel money from doctors, for instance, they seem to understand the convertible debt a little bit more than safes, but safes are by far better for founders. So we would recommend you go the safe route versus convertible debt. We could talk about why. So why do we use convertible notes and safes versus issuing equity? The issue is you don't really know how to price the company, right? I mean, you may come up with a valuation cap for these convertible instruments, but if you sell equity today, someone has to price the round. And when the company is in the idea phase, it's really not worth a lot. I mean, you're basically pegging a valuation in those convertibles for what you think the company will grow to, right? And how much the company you want to give away. But you can't really say when you just have an idea or you have a little bit of code that it's truly worth $10 million on the market, for instance. So that's why you would use a safe or a note. Okay. So what's a convertible note? So convertible note is debt, right? It accrues interest like any other debt that you would get from a bank, for instance. And it will eventually convert into capital stock, so into shares of preferred at the next financing, right? When you do have a future priced round. It usually converts at a discount to the new money price in that round, and that's determined based on whether the economics of the note have a discount and or a valuation cap, which we could talk about a little bit later. And often, like the next equity financing needs to raise at least a certain threshold of new money. For instance, like you need to raise at least 2 million in new cash in an equity round for my note to convert. And that's really just a means for the investors to know that this next round is a real round and not just you trying to convert their debt out of debt into equity. Two other things that are important for notes is obviously there are usually triggers for defaults, which means that the notes become immediately due. Usually a note has an 18 to 24 month maturity date. But if the company goes into bankruptcy or becomes insolvent, obviously that note is going to become immediately due. It's very similar to the way you think about bank loans in that sense. And then the notes, one of the pluses of holding a note as an investor versus a safe is it's actually debt. It's not secured. It's usually unsecured debt, but because it's debt, they get paid off in a liquidity event before a safe would. A safe is treated as stock for tax purposes, and the notes would get paid off before founders. Now, what's a safe? So a safe is very similar, except it's not debt, right? It's treated as stock, so it's much more founder friendly. There's no interest. There's no maturity date. You're technically not a creditor if you hold the note. There's no event of default, right? And it's not treated as a liability on the balance sheet. So there's a lot of reasons why the safe is great. And by the way, the convertible notes and the safes, they have very limited, very, very limited company representation. So the process of selling a safe, just from a cost perspective, is incredibly cheap compared to issuing equity. That's another benefit of using these.
Yeah, and the benefit of these convertible notes or instruments is one, the investor is betting on you guys, number one, and then the team. And then it's a cheap way for them to get money into the business now. And they ultimately want to own equity in the business. They don't really care too much about the interest and whatnot. They really want to get shares, and they want to get you to another level of fundraising where they're getting more institutional funds in. So
exactly. And that's the point of the slide. Like they want to hit a home run, right? A lot of angel investors that are putting money in, they think a lot like VCs, right? I mean, maybe some of them are your friends and family who are just kind of helping you out and hoping to get somewhat of a return on their money or their money back at all at some future date. But to the extent you're raising a real round, they're going to want to see a real multiple. And so they're really not investing for the interest. They're investing for the future equity.
And convertible notes are not typically secured. We had that question in the in there, and we're happy to share the presentation after, by the way.
Yep, no problem. Okay, so what are some of the key terms? So it's really the economics, right? How do they convert and at what price? So the conversion in an equity round is typically, right? So if you look at the YC forms, for instance, they used to have, and I would say predominantly this is still the case, where an investor wants to see a discount off of they want to receive the better of a discount off of the next price round, or the price if they converted at a predetermined valuation cap, right? If you look at the YC forms, they kind of have one or the other now. And if you can get away with that, great. I will say on the investor side, when I have investor representation, we pretty much demand both. Because that's just predominant. It's better for the investor, and it's predominantly what the market has, right? And so what discounts are we looking at? So when I say discount off the next price round, let's say the equity round is $1 per share and you have a 20% discount, you're going to be they're going to be converting 80 cents per share, for instance. And then when we talk about valuation cap, and I would say 20% is the most common. I know we say 10 to 25, but 20% is the most common. Price based off of valuation cap. So that's a pre or post money. The way to think about that is how much of the company you want to give away. So for instance, if you're raising $1 million in your pre-seed round at a post-money valuation of 10 million, right? Then you're giving away 10% of the round in that financing in your pre-money pool. All right, sorry guys, we're running out of time, so I'll just kind of speed up a bit. So there's often in the notes an optional conversion at maturity, either into common or preferred. That's often negotiated again. Another reason why safes are easier than notes, there's a lot more to negotiate in a note than there is in a safe. There's no even a default in the safe. Amendments, the way you think about amendments or voting thresholds, it's always good to have your convertibles be able to be amended by a majority of the principal, because it's easier to change the terms later if you need to. Most safes, they're issued, they convert later, no one touches them. But sometimes the new investor will ask you to change some of the terms. And so you may need to amend them as part of the process. So what's important to understand, and this is one of the differences between pre and post, is how do you define fully diluted capitalization? So when you think about pre and post, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a slide, what goes into the denominator when figuring out the conversion price is important. So is it the full equity pool reserve, right? And not necessarily issued options, but just the reserve? Does it include other convertible securities like the notes or the safes, warrants, et cetera, that aren't actual voting securities on the cap table? Yeah. And we'll talk about that more.
Yeah, real quick, the formula matters. The formula matters. So you need to understand what formula you're putting forth in your safes. Okay, anyways.
Yeah. And then treatment and a change of control. Again, this is also something that's pretty straightforward in a safe, but often negotiated in notes. In a safe, it's pretty simple. You usually get the better of your money back, or what you would do if you converted at the valuation cap. In notes, sometimes people will negotiate a premium, so like a guaranteed return on their money. And that's, it just is one of the terms that's discussed. In the next price round, these convertibles will convert into preferred stock. Typically, they are converting into not the same preferred stock as the new money, because they're converting at a discount. You want them to convert into what we call a shadow series of preferred, or safe preferred if it's in a safe agreement. And that's really meant to mean in the next equity round, one of the benefits of preferred stock is you get a liquidation preference, you may get dividends, et cetera. And you want to make sure that that preference is pegged on their lower conversion price as opposed to the higher new money price that other investors are investing. And that's important for the founders when it comes to how much money you get on a sale, for instance.
Yeah, and just real quick, just to give you a quick example. So the reason why they have these shadow preferred is that, let's say you put $1 million in on a safe note, and then you eventually get $1.2 million worth of value. Well, the other investors, they don't want to give you a protection of $1.2 million. They want to give you protection of the actual cash you put in, the $1 million. That's why they create those shadow preferreds. We can get that's enough for this call, but we can explain it more later. But
yeah, sorry guys, we're just running out of time. So a few other things that investors may ask for, depending on their check size or how sophisticated they are. They may ask for side letters asking for participation rights. It's the right to put in more money at a future time. Most favored nation rights, that's the right to get better economic terms. If you offer, let's say they're buying a safe or getting a safe and you issue a safe later with a higher discount, for instance, they may an MFN would give them the better terms. Security interest in assets. Again, most promissory notes are unsecured, but depending on your situation, some may ask for it to be secured, which is very atypical. So we should certainly talk about it if that's the case. Major investor rights in the next round, potentially that includes information rights. Amendments on terms of these convertibles, negative covenants or like blocks on sales of the business. Again, that's very uncommon at this stage. Some institutional funds may ask you to cover their legal expenses, $5,000, $10,000 to do an initial review, although that's also uncommon. And they may negotiate for a board observer or board seat in the next round when the board is more established. Okay, so pre versus post. This is really important concept to understand. So when you're thinking about valuation, right, in your safes and your notes, the question is, okay, well, what valuation do I pick? And whether it's pre or post. The YC uses post-money valuations, and they do that because, because the investors lobbied them to, because it gives the investors a better understanding of what they're going to own at conversion, right? And so what's important to understand is these instruments, if you convert at the cap, so ignoring the discount for now, if there is one, if you convert at the cap, you're converting at the cap divided by company capitalization, right? And so basically you have to determine what is in that denominator of company capitalization, and whether it's pre or post will change what is in there, right? So when you think of company capitalization in the pre-money context, that excludes all convertible securities. So all of the safes, all of the notes that you are issuing, right, to these investors, whether it be in this round or a future round, those are not included in the denominator. Whereas in the post-money valuations, they are included in the denominator. So as you can imagine, if you agreed to a $10 million post-money valuation cap and you're raising 1 million today, but then you later go out and raise more, right? We see these founders who will just like do this drips pre-seed funding for years, right? Because it's cheaper and easier for them to do. And they don't really realize that they're giving away, in some cases, all of the company, right? So these are our words of caution. With post money, you can wipe out all of your ownership, essentially, like dilute yourself to such a small percentage that it's no longer worth it, right? And then investors don't want to put money into you in the next round because they don't think that you have enough skin in the game, right? So you just want to be really careful about how you do that. And we'll go through a couple examples in the next slides. But the pre-money valuations are better for the company. We always encourage our clients to use pre-money. Investors will sometimes push back just because YC's made post-money pretty standard these days. But if you're going to use post-money, you really just have to be careful about how many safes and convertible notes you issue before you get to the next price round. And we have 1 minute. So let me just finish this example. So in our example, we have founder shares, 8 million founder shares, a 2 million option pool. So there's 10 million shares fully diluted. If you have a pre-money safe, right, at a $10 million valuation cap, and you issue, this is an example, if you issue 2.5 million in pre-money safes versus 4 million in pre-money safes. So if you issue 2.5 million in pre-money safes, then the safes are in addition. So the 10 million does not include the safes. So you would divide the 10 million valuation cap by the outstanding or fully diluted shares, ignoring the safes. So in this case, the 8 million founder shares and the 2 million option pool. So the safe price is $1, right? And then if you look at the 4 million pre-money safes sold, it's the same thing. The price is the same, right? Because regardless of how many safes you issue, the denominator is the same. It is not impacted by how many safes you sell. Now in the post-money example, right, look at the difference. Here, if you issue, again, 10 million valuation cap, but in this case, a post-money valuation cap, if you issue 2.5 million versus 4 million, the price went from $1 to 75 cents, right? If you issued 2.5, And then if you issue 4, it went from $1 in our pre-money example to 60 cents. So how many safes you issue really does impact your dilution.
And you can clearly see that the pre-money safes are much more beneficial from a dilution to founder point of view than the post-money.